Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's webinar. Welcome to any newcomers and welcome back to anyone who attended last night's webinar. I'm Dominic Enter, I'm the Livestock Project Officer for StockSense, and I'll be your host tonight. It's a bit about the project and then we'll get into it. StockSense is funded by the Cattle Compensation Fund and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund and proudly delivered by the VFF Livestock Group. And it was established to help Victorian livestock producers maintain and improve animal health, welfare, and Victoria's overall biosecurity status. We do this through workshops, webinars, and we have a whole lot of information online. That's how you can keep in touch with us. Our website, vff.org.au/StockSense, is a good place to go. We will have a feedback form emailed out at the end of tonight's webinar. If you could fill that out, that'd be great so we can plan future webinars better. And we do have upcoming workshops. There's a list there for March, April, and May, and you can sign up for those on our website. Last night, we covered part 1, Calving Essentials, with Dr. Rob Bonnano, and tonight we will be covering part 2, which is preventative methods to calving a whole system approach. Before we get into it, a bit of housekeeping. Q&A we'll have at the end. Please type questions into the box. The presentation and question time will be an hour and a half altogether, and slides will be sent out to you via email along with a link to the recording. So welcome back, Rob. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Dom. And yeah, tonight you've got the unfortunate experience of having to look at my ugly face because I managed to work out how to fix my my computer camera. So yeah, so tonight you'll be able to look at me as well as listen to me. I'm going to share my screen, and I welcome back everybody that's come back from last night. And the people that have come back from last night, you'll notice that the first part of the presentation tonight is really very much just reviewing what we talked about last night. Now, I think that that's important that we review it because I always tell people that, you never really remember stuff the first time you see it or hear it. And so going over it again, I think, is probably reasonably valuable. But as we get towards the middle and end of the presentation, I'm going to expand a little bit on some of the stuff and some of the concepts. I won't be talking as much tonight about the actual presentations of calves and some of the practical stuff about getting calves out, but I'm absolutely happy to answer questions about that at the end. So if you had any questions after last night and they've been sitting there in your little head burning a hole in it and you just want to ask, please do. I'm very, very happy to cover off those questions at the end. I've got a few less slides tonight, and so we hopefully will have a little bit more time to actually chat at the end, make it a bit more interactive. Basically, I talked last night about how the way we manage our cows prior to calving affects the viability of the calf, and that's really important because if the calves are born weak or they're born compromised, they will certainly not have the same, I suppose, exposure to an opportunity really to grow healthy and successful and then carve themselves in as adults and do well. And in a beef scenario, if the calf's not born alive, that cow, you've carried her all year for nothing. And so, it's really important and really, really essential to profitability that we first of all get the cows in calf and the heifers in calf, but then we get a live calf out of them that survives and thrives. And so the idea that supervision and management of the calving process, where we can provide timely assistance when it's required, that is, again, an essential component, because if you leave cows and heifers to their own devices, you'll probably end up with somewhere around 5 to 10% of cows heifers, and 2 to 3% of cows might require some assistance. And so if you think about that, if you were to reduce if you think about what the profit margin is on an enterprise, if you were to knock 10 or 15% of your calves out of that enterprise, the profit's becoming pretty thin. And so, being good at this and paying a good attention to calving time is a really, really valuable part of the production cycle. So just to review from last night we talked, a bit about preparing for calving, the stages of labour, preventing some of the dystocias, calving problems, assisting with the dystocias in our 20-minute rule, and a little tiny bit about caring for the newborn calf. And I'll probably review those factors just quickly as we go through now. I talked last night about how it's important it is to have your calving kit. And I'm going to reiterate that again because, as I say, when I go out on farm, the number of times that I get out on farm and I see farmers that are pulling calves with bits of baling string or, rusty old chains, and they don't have the equipment that I think is essential in order to be able to do the job well and deliver a calf in a professional and hygienic way. I talked a little bit about last night about calving jacks versus calving pulleys and the appropriateness or otherwise of using anything other than a calving jack or pulley. I know that somebody asked last night a question around using wire strainers, and I know that people use wire strainers, but my comment there, and I reiterate that comment, is that I don't consider them to be appropriate because they're very difficult to release the tension in a way that's not sort of all or nothing. They very much, they can put a lot of pull on, but releasing a set of wire strainers can be quite difficult, and it can take a little bit of time. And if you need to make a quick adjustment because the heifer or cow is about to go down or she's about to tear, anything like winches, pulleys, motorbikes, tractors, etc., they just aren't able to make those adjustments. And so I definitely wouldn't be recommending using anything other than a calving pulley or calving jack. I talked again last night, and I'll reiterate it here because I think it's important. Use lube. Obstetrical lubricant isn't expensive. It's freely available. You can buy it over the counter in rural stores. You can get it from AOA and semen sales providers. There's lots of places where you can buy it. It's relatively cheap, and if you use a clean, sterile lubricant to try and help to allow a calf to have an easier birth, easier passage through the birth canal, that's got to be a good thing. And so I encourage people to use lubricant. And because of the risks of some of the diseases, the zoonotic diseases that can spread from a calving cow to a human, I do encourage people to wear gloves. And I especially recommend that herds be vaccinated for leptospirosis, and that the people working with those animals, particularly if they're assisting with birthing, that the people should be vaccinated for Q fever, because I know that in Gippsland, where I live, we're seeing multiple cases of Q fever in farm workers this year, and I don't necessarily understand why it's been such a cluster of them now, because it's a fairly widespread organism. But there's no doubt that we're seeing an increased number of cases. We especially see it in casual staff that have not had previous exposure to farm animals, getting exposed to it for the first time when they're helping with a calving or something like that. So again, if you've got only a few cows and you've got a friend or a relative or a neighbour that's going to help you with a calving delivery, if they've never been vaccinated, just be aware of that risk. I like our calving kit to have some towels in it so that we can stimulate the calf. I also like lots of clean water, and I like to be able to identify the calf as soon as it's born to make sure that we don't mix the calves up so we get the wrong calf accredited to the wrong cow. And I also think that dipping or spraying the navel in a chlorhexidine or iodine spray is a really, really good method of preventing disease entering the calf through that navel. Calf coats are great, particularly for the cold weather. I think it's important that we understand these behavioural changes that the cows are telling us that they're about to calve. They go off on their own. They'll go and separate themselves. They might become restless. They might get up and down. And they might also show some physical signs like their udder will swell, their vagina or vulva will swell and become soft, and the ligaments beside the tail mean that the tail starts to drop. And when that's happening, we know that the calving they're just about ready to go, and so we know to keep a good eye on them. And I talked last night, and I'll remind you again of the 3 stages of labour, because it is important that we are familiar with normal calving behaviour. Because if we're familiar with what's normal, what's abnormal becomes easier to recognise. The heifers hang around in stage 1 labour for a longer time. Up to 12 hours can be quite normal for a heifer. And so it's just a case of observing enough but not too much. And I do think that that's an important strategy, is knowing and understanding the different stages. And so we talked last night about how, these behaviours will indicate that a heifer or a cow is in her first stage of labour. And once the water bag's there, we know that they're definitely on the job. And if we don't see any progress after, say, maybe 6 hours, we would definitely be thinking something's going on here. And when I say no progress after, say, 6 hours, that's assuming that nothing's showing. Because once a foot or a head or something starts to show, then they really are actually in stage 2 labour. And stage 2 labour is where the cervix is fully dilated. And these cows at this stage should progress. And so once you see them actively straining, so they're contracting, they might lay down. And by straining, we know that they're actually in active labour. Once a cow's in active labour, we really need her to progress. And if she's not making progress, we do need to consider what we should do next. Because once the calf enters the birth canal, it should be expelled within sort of 30 minutes, no more than 4 hours, and they should be making regular, slow progress. I describe the ideal calving as a cow or heifer. You'll see the water bag, and then you see feet, and then you see feet and nose, and then feet and nose and eyes, and then feet, nose, eyes, ears, and that slow progression, and then the calf flops out of the cow and is delivered. And I think that's what we're looking for. That's a successful, gradual progress, a successful calving. The third stage is when they pass the membranes, and a lot of people go, oh well, who cares? The passing of membranes is an important part of the labour, because if a cow retains her afterbirth more than, say, 12 hours, so she hasn't passed the membranes, going back, even when I went through vet school, about 30-something years ago, 35 years ago, we were taught that we had to go into those cows and clean them. So we would go in and actually physically remove the placenta from a cow who'd retained. We thought that if we added weight to the retained placenta and we put some, like a rock or a stick or something, tied it to it, the weight would pull the membranes out. And let me tell you that is absolutely not correct. The passage of the membranes is an active process that's coordinated by the immune system. It's kind of the immune system literally rejecting the membranes. And so if a cow is retaining her membranes, it usually is an indication to me that something has gone wrong in her immune process. And she may be immunocompromised. And if you've got a cow if you have a high incidence of retained afterbirth, maybe 4 per 100 or more, then that would be starting to suggest to me that those cows may be immunocompromised. And we might be considering, okay, what should we do to investigate this immune system? And it could be vitamins, it could be minerals, it could be antioxidants, anything that's associated with immune competence and immune status. And so the third stage of labour, even though like the big shows happen, the calf's born, it's on the ground, that third stage of cleaning is actually quite an important part. And so I would encourage people, if they're seeing more than about, as I say, 4 per 100 cows retaining their afterbirth, that rather than just simply treating the retained placenta, maybe with antibiotics, etc., you actually start to do a bit of a deeper dive, which is what I'm kind of, the theme of tonight's is actually looking more into the problem rather than just simply dealing with what's in front of you. So we talked last night about, the fancy vet word for a difficult calving or a difficult birth is dystocia or dystocia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I actually don't care how you pronounce it. I usually call it calving problems, but the correct term is dystocia. And people say, well, why did the cow have problems calving? And we talked last night about fat cows, and we talked about, the calf being too big or the heifer or cow being too small. We talked about the uterus having weak or absent contractions, and the idea that you can get things like twisted uteruses or calves that are malpresented. And then we thought, which ones of those can we control? And really, you can't control how a calf presents itself. If it's going to come upside down, backwards, legs back, heads twisted to the side, we can do very little to manage that. Twisted uteruses, maybe we can influence that by the paddock that we carve them in, or if we transport them close to calving. But usually, it kind of happens. It can be associated with oversized calves, where the calf is just big, and the cow spends a lot of time getting up and down, and then eventually her uterus just twists. But fat cows and big calves and small cows and small heifers, or weak, underfed or weak, metabolically unwell cows, we can actually do something about that. We can manage that. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit more as we go later in the night, because they are basically the areas where we can proactively address the issue of calving problems. So sure, we need to intervene if we've got a problem, and we need to deal with the problem that's in front of us at that moment. We've got to assist that calf. We should follow good practice and do what we can to get them out. And we should, if there's not been progression after 6 hours, or if they've been straining for a couple of hours going nowhere, or if there's an obvious malpresentation, we should do something. I again completely emphasizing, and I know VFF have done work in this space about the importance of safe and fit for purpose facilities to handle the animals. Because if you're trying to deliver a calf from an anxious heifer tied behind a gate, or caught in a corner of a paddock, tied to a tree, or the bull bar of a ute, it is so dangerous for the animal, but it's more dangerous for the people assisting that animal. And so I would, again, if you don't have good facilities that are well maintained and safe, please go and get them sorted out. It's work health and safety is pretty much non-negotiable in today's day and age. And as a vet who's suffered multiple injuries from trying to do jobs in subpar facilities, I would suggest to you that it's probably I've got injuries that will be with me for my entire rest of my career, based on the fact that I've done dumb things in poor yards. The intervention that you do will depend on your experience and your judgment. And I talked last night about how we need to know our limitations and work within our level of skill and experience. And if you've got a good crush, and you've got a well-stocked calving box, and you're doing it nice and clean, and you're lubricating well, you've checked that all this stuff is on hand, ready to go, I think that you can then at least have a go at trying to assist calves, if you've got even the most basic of skills, because surprisingly often, it doesn't require that much assistance to get them out. The bottom point that I've made here is around the hygiene, and I really cannot emphasize them enough.
Hey, Rob, sorry to cut in.
Yep.
We're still on the home page for your slides.
Oh, seriously?
I thought we were just summarising last night's.
No, I'm working through slides.
Sorry about that.
I'm up to slide 12. You're still on my homepage, are you?
Yep.
Let me go and see what I can do. I might have to move my camera and shut this down here and see what happens there. Have you advanced slides now?
There we go. Yeah, that's working now. Yeah.
Sorry about that, Steve.
We've got your presenter view now, but
I've got my presenter view. Okay, let me expand on that. I will remove. If I escape out of that. Yeah, like that. And I'm gonna have to. Can you still see my presenter view?
Yep.
Let me go to. What about now?
That's good.
Can you see the slide equipment for assistance?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, perfect.
How about I flick back quickly through some slides? And
we'll email these out too for everyone.
Sorry about that. I'm just charging on through, thinking that I was talking about stuff. And so,
Nah, it's probably my fault. All good.
okay, so I'm talking here about the hygiene, it being the bottom point on the slide that you can now see, and the equipment, including our arms, needs to be thoroughly cleaned. I talked last night about how, the basic principles. Make sure that you can get your hand over the top of the calf's head and down beside its shoulders. Sort of, if you can do that, and if you can pull the front legs and get the fetlocks just a hand's width past the vulva, just pulling on the legs with just your own strength, you normally will almost always be able to pull that calf out with some assistance. And same goes if the calf's coming backwards. If you put your hand in and you can get your hand over the rump of the calf, so you can get it over the pelvis of the calf and sort of feel all the way around that calf, and you can pull that calf up with the hand traction and get the hocks or the pointy bit up level with the vulva, you're on a winner. I like the bit here about, when to call the vet. If you can't provide the assistance yourself or the cow's been going a long time, if you've gone in to check a cow that just sort of hasn't seemed to progress and you can't find anything, no heads, no head, no legs, anything, that's probably a job for the vet. Sometimes you'll get caught out because they might have been fidgeting around and their cervix is still closed and everything's fine. But I think it's always better to be safe than sorry if you're not sure. If you can't push your arm into the birth canal because there's a twist, then that's a vet job often. And if they're not making progress, I think that's a really important part to remember, is that if they're not making progress and you've tried everything you can think of, get the vet out. If the calf stinks and is obviously dead, I hate those, but you may as well call the vet. And if the calf's really, really huge and you just think there's just no room here, again, a live calf is, first of all, easier for a vet to manipulate. And second of all, if you've got a live calf, you've got more options as far as the way how we're going to get that calf out of the cow and, what we can do with it. So, better to call too early than too late. I talked about the malpresentation, the 20-minute rule, and how if you're not making progress, that we need to move, on, get someone else more experienced to help you, or get the vets out. And so I thought that's just sort of like a little 15-minute review of what we covered last night. There's, for the people that didn't join last night but have joined tonight, as Dom said, the slides are available. It's available on YouTube. It'd be good to watch because we do go a little bit more into some of the vaccine stuff and the colostrum, approach. But I thought I'd expand a little bit more tonight about how if you've got a problem with calving problems, this is one of my favorite analogies, and it's a big screen to read, but basically what a veterinary colleague once said to me, and I've never forgotten this. He said, a farmer can choose a poor quality bull and then breed the bull to a poor quality cow. They can do a poor job of managing that pregnant cow so that she gives birth to a compromised heifer calf that has poor genetics. They then feed that poor genetics heifer poorly, and they manage her poorly so she doesn't grow well. But that heifer calf finally reaches puberty and she's short of stature and small of frame. And then if you breed that heifer to a bull of inappropriate breed or a bull with poor genetic traits, you've then got a pregnant heifer that's not well managed, and she continues to grow poorly and is left unsupervised at the point where she goes to calve. Because she's a poor quality animal, she doesn't bag up, so nobody realizes she's due to calve. So she's left down the way back in the bottom of the paddock, and she's not seen when she starts to calve. And her labour is not assisted, and her labour fails to progress. And eventually, after a few days, she's noted off under the trees with a little bit of membranes hanging out and basically a bit of a smell. And then the farmer might try and deliver that calf for a couple of hours. They wait until it's nearly dark usually. And then they finally call the vet out to deliver the calf. And my friend said to me, he said, and yet somehow it's all the vet's problem and all the vet's fault when the dead calf is delivered from a now paralysed heifer. And I thought nothing really sums up the experience of a vet delivering disaster calves better than that sort of statement. And when you look at the comments there that I made, it's kind of like we should expect an occasional difficult calving. Things happen. You can have birth deformities, you can have malpresentations, stuff that is completely beyond our control. And we expect that. But if dystocia or calving problems is more than 10 or 15% of your heifers, or more than 3 or 5% of your cows, then you should really think to yourself, is there a bigger picture at play here? Do I need to review what I'm potentially doing wrong that's contributing to this problem? Because, as I say, whilst there's a normal, and I put that sort of in inverted commas, a normal amount of calving difficulty, if your herd, for whatever reason, has an abnormal amount of calving difficulty, then usually doing a little bit of a dive in and seeing what's going on, we can actually get to the bottom of it usually and actually start to improve the concerns and do something about it. Now, in manufacturing and food safety, there's a principle or a thing called HACCP, and probably people are often aware of it. They might have heard of it, but this concept of HACCP is looking at hazard analysis and critical control points. So basically, it looks at each step of a process from beginning to end from a wide view and sees where in that path there are potential risks, and then how we could eliminate the risk, mitigate the risk, or manage the risk. And if you think about calving and producing a live, healthy calf, if we think about it's actually not that different. In fact, it's almost identical, because there are multiple opportunities in the life of a calf, even before its conception, all the way through to it delivering a calf itself, where we have opportunity to do something, take an action that can either eliminate, mitigate, or manage the risk of a poor outcome, which is probably a dead calf, maybe, as I say, a dead heifer. So we talked last night briefly, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more deeply tonight about, if you've got a high incidence of calving problems, maybe it could be one of these few things. It could be your genetics. It could be that you're using the wrong bulls over the wrong cows and making poor decisions often. But sometimes, people just get caught up in a breeding program and don't take into account the risks associated with calving. It could be the early life management of the calves, and that goes right back from colostrum all the way through to nutrition, through that pre-weaning, and then potentially supplementing pre-weaning, and then managing the calves, particularly the heifer calves, to make sure that their early life, they don't have too many setbacks, and that their nutrition and feeding management is up to scratch. Because it doesn't matter how well you do selecting the right bull to put over the right heifer and getting that genetics part of the equation right. If you don't feed them well and you don't look after their early life management, they get setbacks that become cumulative, and that can really impact on their success as a breeding animal later on. Diseases. There are some diseases that can just simply be a result of chronic disease as a young animal. Maybe something like pneumonia or scours in a young animal can set them back so that they fail to hit their targets. I constantly see animals with pneumonia that they were sick as a calf and they didn't die, but they just never thrived. And they're small of size, they'd never really quite reached the potential of where they could and probably should be. And so I do imagine that disease issues in early life all the way through can have impacts on it. And then there are also some specific reproductive diseases that I'll talk about a little bit later that can have really massive impacts on the success or otherwise of a breeding program. Parasites. We probably don't give enough thought to the management of parasites, because if you've got animals, and especially if you have reasonably high stocking densities, and especially if it's in high rainfall areas, parasites can affect the growth rate and the growth potential of young stock, and really have a very significant impact later on down the track, even though you might have wormed them and got rid of those worms, if they've become stunted, then that will have a huge impact on the risk of a cow or a heifer, particularly having calving problems when she calves in as a 2-year-old. Body condition score we talked about last night. I might expand on that a little bit again tonight. And then at the end of the process, the ability for us to supervise and manage calving. And there are factors that come into that, like pregnancy testing and knowing when a cow is likely to calve. If you're using artificial insemination, you've got a conception date, so it gives you a due date. And so making good decisions around how we're going to supervise and manage those calving cows and heifers is a really, really, valuable tool to think about how that might be contributing to your calving problems. The cow health, of course, is important. Weak, sick cows that come into calving time unwell, whether it be because they've had a rapid change of diet, just before they've calved, or because they've just had some other health issues that have not been addressed. Sick cows have sick calves or dead calves. So we talk a little bit about the sire selection, and a lot of the time, the sires that we use, like if we're trying to produce beef calves especially, we want calves that are going to grow to be big and the most efficient that they can be, so that we can get the most kilograms of beef on the ground in the shortest period of time. And so the temptation to go for high growth rate bulls is always there. But if you select a bull that is inappropriate for the size of the cow or the breed of cow that you have, you can end up with these disproportionately large calves. To some extent, the nutrition during pregnancy can impact and influence the size of the calf, but the genetics are certainly a large component of the size of the calf. And so if we select a sire that's got good calving ease, we can really minimize the likelihood of these oversized calves, and especially in heifers. And a lot of the time, people don't AI their heifers; they just run a bull out with them. And if that bull is an unknown quantity, his genetics are not known. You really are basically rolling the dice and hoping like hell that you don't end up with a bull that throws big calves. And so the genetics and understanding the genetics of the animals, the bulls, particularly the sires that you're using, and then also the influence that the sire selection can have on the future calving ease of the replacement animals is a really important factor. Now, I've gotten myself into trouble by making this statement before. I really do not believe that selecting genetics that have extreme calving difficulty, or genetics of particular breeds of bulls that are heavily muscled, that are commonly associated with high birth weights or high incidence of dystocia, I really do not believe that they are appropriate to use over animals where you've got a herd that's not going to have sufficient calving supervision or calving management skill. And so what I mean by that is that would be potentially new entrants into, or hobby farmers. They get their eyes on these gigantic, big muscled bulls, and they get all excited about the great calves they're going to breed. But if you're not there to supervise the calving because you either don't live on the farm or nobody lives on the farm and you're only able to supervise them on weekends, or if you're new to the industry and you're just starting out and you're not really very skilled at handling or delivering calves, I really do not believe that it should be recommended to you to use these extreme bulls that are heavily muscled. Does it mean that your calves might not be as muscly as somebody else's in the sale yards? Absolutely. But you're better off to get a live calf into the sale yards than no calf at all. I often tell producers that dead calves have a terrible growth rate. And the reason for that is that if you don't have a live calf to put in the market, you make nothing. And so I make that statement. I stand behind it. I truly do not believe that using some of these heavily muscled, double muscle breeds in herds where there's not adequate supervision or skill. I don't think they're appropriate. We also now can use bulls that are selected for gestation length. And so particularly in our dairy bulls, we have some really short gestation length bulls. And they can be used to get smaller calves and also to tighten up your calving pattern. So that's an opportunity or an option for sire selection that you can consider. So most people would be familiar with EBVs, or estimated breeding values. And when we talk about calving ease, there's two different types of EBV, or of estimated breeding value. And the one that I think is really important for, say, somebody who's just growing out, like they've got a herd of crossbred cows and they want to put a bull over those cows and they want to produce some steers and some heifers that are going for slaughter. This is the one that you want to look at, the calving ease direct EBV, because this is the actual estimate of the genetic difference from one bull to another relative to average. So in other words, if a bull is a high calving ease direct EBV, you would expect on average that his calves are going to be easier to deliver. And so the higher or more positive the calving ease direct EBV is, the better that is. And so we're looking for, if we've got a systemic problem and we're getting big calves that are causing us a lot of trouble with calving problems, we're going to go and look for a bull in either a sale catalogue or a semen catalogue who's got a high calving ease direct EBV. So if you buy a bull with a calving ease direct EBV of +5 compared to a bull of -1, there's 6% difference in those bulls, and then the bull contributes half the problem. So you could reduce your calving difficulties by 3%, and you think, well, 3%, but if that's 3 more calves out of every 100 cows that are delivered and alive and healthy, then you might be talking about several thousands of dollars per 100 cows difference. And so, because we have to halve that bull genetic effect because that calving ease direct effect is the direct effect that bull has on that calf. And so we need to be aware that we've got to halve what his contribution is, because he only produces half the calf. So the next EBV that's important is the calving ease daughter. So the daughter calving ease EBV, because what that is that the EBV for daughters is basically looking at a bull and saying, how much better are his daughters going to be than average? And so if they calve as a 2-year-old, how much less likely are they to have a difficult calving? So if you select bulls that have high direct EBV and high daughter EBVs, not only will you get calves that are born more easily this season, but in 2 years' time, if you've kept those heifer calves and are breeding from them, in 2 years' time, you will get the benefit from that breeding selection as well. So you can not only influence the impact of this generation, like this lot of calves born in, but also future generations. And so investing in bulls or semen that have better than average calving ease is sort of like the gift that keeps giving. And so I tell people that the calving ease direct EBV is important to all beef producers, because getting live calves on the ground is how you make your money. And so it's the best estimate we've got realistically of what the genetic impact that bull is going to have on that calf. But if you're retaining daughters, or if you're a seed stock producer, so if you're somebody who's producing animals to sell to somebody else to breed on with, I think that the calving ease daughter EBV becomes equally as important, because we see this in herds that have been selecting for several generations. Multiple generations of selecting better than average will result in quite significant reductions in calving problems over multiple generations. And that if you select carefully, the result can be cumulative as well. So you actually are almost getting like compound interest on your genetic selections. And so don't overlook the importance of genetics. If you are having problems with calving problems, think first and foremost, are my genetics contributing to this? I've rabbited on about this dam stature and the size of the cows and the heifers because it is, to me, probably one of the most common reasons why we get called out for really, really disastrous calvings. And it's either because of one of two things, that the cow or the heifer isn't as well grown as she should be, so she's had setbacks, or they've got in calf, particularly heifers, way too young. And so if you've got a small undergrown heifer that might have got in calf early because either she jumped the fence, the bull jumped the fence, or you just were asleep at the wheel and they ended up getting accidentally mated. Those, 15, 16, 17-month-old heifers that are, not even up to your belly button, trying to deliver, when we say we're trying to get a calf out of a calf, if you can improve your dam stature, the size of the heifer, we're winning. And this idea of trying to get your heifers to calve at around 90% of your mature body weight, that's an aim that very, very few farms regularly achieve. And but the best producers are striving to have cows, heifers calving at around about sort of 90% at 24 months of age of what the mature cow average body weight is. And if you think about a calf that was born at 35 or 40 kilos, to get to 570 kilos by 24 months, they've got to put on nearly half a kilo or more, probably at least half a kilo a day, every day of their life. And so, if they have giant periods of time where they get set back, they won't be achieving those growth rates. But what animals, particularly beef cows, are really good at doing is what's called compensatory growth. So if they've gone through a bit of a hard time, they might be thin and they're not, looking too good. Their low body condition score, and then the season turns around and the feed suddenly becomes plentiful. Those animals will regain the weight and kind of catch up. So if you go purely on body weight alone, you'll often get the animals to the targets and you say, they had a tough time when they were little, but I got them there in the end. And you might have supplemented them, get them there, and you think you've got them over the line, and yet you will still have calving problems, because if they don't grow skeleton, but they just put condition on, you can actually end up with dumpy little short animals that are heavy, but with small frames and small statures. And they can have just as many calving difficulties as the skinny small ones. And sometimes even more. And so I do encourage people to be aware that whilst you often can think you've caught up on the lost growth, if that compensatory growth does not include skeletal growth, if it's just they've put on extra muscle and body fat to make up the weight, that they haven't got any taller or wider, you can still have a lot of trouble. So trying to make sure that you grow your heifers so that they continually reach their targets where you want them to be is critical. And I put out the challenge to people: how many heifers do achieve this level of constant and regular growth? Our best producers weigh their animals and benchmark them and do all these things that people say to me, I just don't have the time. And I think I'd rather spend a few hours every couple of months weighing my heifers, making sure that they're on target and growing, than spend those same few hours wallowing in the mud trying to pull a calf out of a half-sized heifer. And so that it's about where you put your effort. And I encourage producers to be proactive and actually prevent problems rather than react to them. And so, if you can do what you can to make sure that your heifers and you grow out well, and that your cows maintain a good body condition, I think that's really important. So, if they're small or undergrown, undersized heifers are contributing to your calving problems, you really need to look at their whole of life. They're both their nutrition, their disease management, and their parasite management. Because if you're not, if you're dropping the ball anywhere there, you can actually find that you can do all the right things with the genetics. You can, do everything you want to do with genetics and select for, low calving ease, and low calving difficulties. But if you don't rear them well, you still got the problems. Parasite management plans are something that I'm surprised at how few farms that I talk to really have a structured parasite management plan. They'll often say, "Oh, they were looking a bit wormy, so I gave them a drench." And yeah, while that's important, I would rather people actually have some kind of structure to their management plan. And I do think that you should be talking to a herd advisor if you're not 100% sure on what to do, whether that be a veterinarian or whether it be a consultant, just so that you've got somebody giving you some advice, and performing regular worm egg counts, and even performing worm egg counts after you've drenched them, because worm egg resistance or parasite resistance is becoming increasingly problematic, and and especially if people are using pour-on drenches and have done for a long time. Um, my opinion of pour-on drenches is not high. They're really convenient. I love the ease of use for them, but as far as their effectiveness, they're somewhat less than what we would think is ideal. And so now I try and encourage people. I've written vaccinating. I mean drenching. Consider drenching your young stock spring, summer, and autumn, at least. And you need to use an effective drench. And so we want an effective drench that we've either demonstrated that it's effective on the farm, or we're using one of the multiple active drenches. There's a number of injectable and oral multiple actives. And the reason why we like that is because multi-actives, if you use a single style of drench, a single type of drench, and there is resistance to that drench, then those worms will survive and contribute to the next generation. If you use a double or triple active drench, the likelihood of the worm being resistant to 2 or 3 different actives, the same worm, is actually quite low. And so we see effectiveness of drenches go up into the high 90%, 99, 98% effective when we combine a couple of different actives in the one drench. Whereas we're seeing efficacies on particularly some of the pour-on drenches in the 60s, as a percentage of effectiveness. And so that's pretty disgraceful. And so you might think that you're doing a good job of worming your animals, but if you're unlucky enough to have either brought in some resistant worms or developed some resistant worms all by yourself, a worm egg count will help to identify whether that's a problem for you. We talked last night, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about body condition score. Really fat, really thin. I think that's a really simple message. Really fat cows are, I call them just metabolically lazy. They're fat, lazy cows, that can't deliver a calf as easily as a cow that's in her ideal body condition. And very thin cows are just often too weak. The physical difficulty part of very fat cows can be multiple. They can get cast, and that's where they basically lay down to calve, and they're just that damn fat that they just roll around and can't get themselves, their feet under them, and to get up again. And a cow that becomes cast can quite quickly die. They can bloat, they can regurgitate, a whole lot of things can go wrong if a cow gets herself caught on a hill, particularly facing down the hill, and she's just a bit too rotund to get up. And I especially see that in rough paddocks, and I used to see it when I lived in the Goulburn Valley in people that put beef cows in old tomato paddocks that had the humps and the hollows. And so I do think that physical difficult component of really fat cows is significant. And then very thin cows are metabolically weak, and especially if you unfortunately run into a bit of a feed pinch right at the end of their pregnancy, and it's cold and wet and miserable, those poor little thin cows just don't have the oomph to push the calf out. And sometimes there's no real reason why they couldn't or shouldn't have calved. They just didn't have the strength to push it out. In extreme cases, I've actually had cows that were so fat that they had fat pads in their birth canal that were huge, like big as my head, lumps of fat that I've ended up having to do a episiotomy, or a small cut in the lip of the vulva to actually allow this huge fat blob to come out, to allow the calf to be able to fit through the birth canal. Now, if you've got cows that are that fat, you really do have to look at your nutrition and the management of the nutrition of the cows, because we do see that from time to time. But when you're sort of pulling a calf and you get one of these big fat blobs, it really is quite spectacular. So I talked last night about the transition management and feeding. It's much more common in our dairy animals, and it's much more probably significant in our dairy animals because they do tend to have higher incidence of metabolic disease. But in our, particularly with some of our beef cows that have been selected for maternal traits, their milk production can be really quite good. And if people are using crossbred, cows, baldy cows that have come out of dairy stock, they can be at just as high a risk of metabolic disease as a dairy cow. So I do think that if you're seeing calving problems associated with metabolic disease, cows being down pre-calving, etc., getting milk fevers and that sort of thing, that you do need to get some advice and assistance with your transition management, because we've got, as I said, really good data on in dairy animals. But if I've had beef herds where they might have 10% of the cows being affected by metabolic disease, and that's really seriously impacting the viability of those calves because they're either prolapsing or delivering dead calves. They're getting a calf half out and just running out of calcium to push it out, and so those dead calves, we might be able to get the cow back up with a bag of calcium, but in a beef herd, if you lose the calf, you've lost the profit. And so it's a really important thing that if it is contributing to your calving problems, you can get a nutritionist, a vet, a consultant, somebody to help you with that transition diet to make sure you're getting it right. And then the other thing that I talk about with transition, it's about getting the right cows in the right place at the right time. Making sure that you've got the cow where she needs to be. We know that a gestation for a cow is going to be 282 or 283 days plus or minus 10. That's the vast majority of cows will be plus or minus 10 days from that due date. So if you've got her close by, you've got at least a chance of identifying if she's in trouble, because finding those ones out over under the trees or laying in, bogged in a dam, down the back paddock, you've lost your opportunity to intervene and do something to save them. I also really think, and I see this way more in our beef animals than I do in our dairy animals, that they're just in our part of the world, in Victoria, where we're not extensive, we're not up in the top end of the country where the cattle never see people. They should know what people are. Our cows and our heifers should be comfortable enough with us walking, riding, or driving through them. They should not be fleeing to the bottom corner of the paddock so that you can't observe them. And if you have not managed your cows well enough in the period of time leading up to calving, where you can manage to supervise them, that can be a huge factor in calving difficulties, because you're not able to observe them, so you're not able to intervene in a timely manner. And so if I go to a farm and they're pretty much a no care, no responsibility kind of calving setup where the cows are out way in the back paddock and nobody's actively supervising the calving cows, and they tell me that they've got 10 or 15% losses of calves, I'm kind of not surprised, because we know that 10 or 15% of animals are likely to have some kind of calving difficulty if they're heifers, and that's a normal abnormality. And so if I haven't managed my cows and my heifers so that I can observe them, and if I don't know when they're due to calve, so I can't bring them back in somewhere close by where I can observe them and get them to a set of yards where I can assist, and all the things that are required for, I think, for good husbandry and good animal care, I think that's a real mistake. And so when I talk about taking proactive steps to reduce the losses of calving problems, this is one of the big ones. If your animals aren't well handled and aren't used to being moved through in some way, shape, or form, whether it be on a bike or in a vehicle or something like that, so that you can just poke through them and just see that one there, she's got a little bit of, she's a bit uncomfortable, she's separated herself off from the mob. I'll come back in, check on her in a few hours and just make sure she's okay. If she's on an out paddock or she's 3 farms away, and you don't go there once a week, you're going to expect to have more problems. So it's finding that balance that's important. And we want to have sufficient supervision, but we don't want to interfere with them and put them off their labour. So there is a little element of skills, experience, stockmanship that's involved in that. And for people that are new entrants to farming or are not familiar with it, it really is more about making the cows familiar with you. And so I use those sort of guidelines of basically we want to observe them if they're in stage 1 labour, not let them go more than 6 hours without being observed again, because if we don't see them in stage 1 and they don't progress, they're the ones that we often find, as I say, over under a tree, maybe with just a little slip of membranes hanging out and a bunch of flies. And you've lost that opportunity to make money out of that cow. So I talked about this, this intervention when we're doing it, and how lots of people are injured trying to assist calving in facilities that are inadequate. I can't emphasize that enough. If you take nothing home out of tonight, I'd like everyone to make sure that their calving facilities are in good order and that their cows are adequately, I suppose, socialized so that you can provide them with the help and the supervision that they need. Managing and preventing diseases from early in life really does have significant impacts. We definitely do not want stick animals undergrown and not making their breeding targets. But we've also got diseases like pestivirus or BVD that we could do 2 whole webinars on pestivirus. It's such a big topic. I'm not even going to attempt to stick my toes into that water. But a disease like pestivirus that's a reproductive disease, a disease like leptospirosis or vibriosis that can affect both conception and also impact the likelihood or risk of abortions. I do think that we should be making sure we're managing these diseases as a part of our proactive overall animal health plan, and to try and maximise the number of live calves we get on the ground. Investigating abortions is really important, especially if your losses from abortion exceeds 2%. Now, they can also be incredibly frustrating, because if you don't get a nice fresh fetus that's not been chewed on by foxes, it's quite hard to get a diagnosis, just from maybe some membranes and some blood. We can do blood tests on the cows. We often do a paired blood sample where we collect one just when they abort, wait a month later, and we collect blood from the same cow and see whether key antibodies have increased in that time that would indicate that she's just seroconverted to that infection. But if we can get fresh, undamaged, unpredated fetuses, we can often get a diagnosis. And the other thing that I would emphasize is that talk to your local vet or your government vet, because in Victoria, we do have access to what's called an SDI, or significant disease investigation, which is where there's funding that is made available for the vets to help to subsidise the cost of investigating significant diseases. And if you're losing more than 2% of your pregnancies from confirmed preg test at sort of 6 or 8 weeks, if you're losing much more than 10%, 2% of them, especially late pregnancies, then that is a significant disease and it warrants investigation. And so reaching out to your local veterinarian or your government veterinarian and accessing this SDI funding is a really good idea. And I strongly encourage people to investigate abortions or losses of fetuses if they exceed certain thresholds. So getting to the end of the actual presentation bit, I'm a bit better on my timing tonight. There's always going to be some cases that require assistance. So no matter what you do, no matter how proactive you are, no matter how well you raise and rear them, no matter what you select genetics-wise, there'll always be some that require assistance. So a big part of being proactive and a big part of our Calving 101 is making sure that we're there and we've got the right equipment, the right facilities, and the right skills to be able to intervene. And so I do believe that accurate calving due dates are a really incredibly valuable tool to reduce your stillbirths, dystocias that end up with dead calves. Because if you have an accurate date, you're looking at those animals, you're observing them closely, and you're more likely to identify a problem. But I also think, as I said earlier, it's so important that the herd's comfortable with people moving around them, whatever method they're moving, remembering, of course, that a cow that's friendly when she's not calving can be quite unfriendly when she is. And so, I do prefer people on, in vehicles or on bikes when they go out to check calving cows, just in case a cow decides she wants to take go at you. And so do be aware of that risk, because you might know the cow really well. You might think that she's really quiet, but if she's anxious or stressed and she's calving or just calved, her natural instincts might overcome her kind-hearted nature. If you have a really serious problem and you're losing more than, as I said, around 10 or 15% of heifers and 3 to 5% of cows, just step back, take a look at the whole problem, because we do know that you can do all the right things with genetics and blow it with poor nutrition. You can manage the diseases really well, but if you don't get the parasites under control, you can still lose growth rate and opportunity. And a lot of the time, it really does unfortunately come down to management skill. And so if you're finding that you're getting lots of calving difficulties and lots of bad outcomes helping to deliver those calves, seeking assistance from somebody more experienced, whether that be a neighbour, a friend, a veterinarian. Now, we do spend a lot of time actually training staff on farms, particularly, as I say, dairy farms, in all these aspects of herd health. If you can, weigh them, make sure that they're growing, monitor their body condition scores. We don't want them fat, we don't want them thin. And if we learn how to practice good, gentle tissue handling, we don't want to be rough. We definitely don't want to be putting dirt and manure inside the reproductive tract of a cow. So good hygiene is critical if we're going to get good outcomes. And that, my friends, is the end of our presentation. And I would love to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Rob. There's some terrific information in there. And I think you really highlighted that there are so many different factors that farmers should be considering when it comes to calving. It is question time. Get them in. There was a comment I thought worth mentioning. I could not agree more about the weighing heifers regularly. We do it all the time, and I always say that body weight data is probably the single most useful piece of information you can have about your cattle. Cost of scales is absolutely worth every cent, and it doesn't have to be a high-tech setup. Thanks for that.
I totally agree. I totally agree. I think that again, people sort of say, oh, it takes a few hours every month or two, every 6 or 8 weeks to weigh the heifers, but getting them in, running them through the yards, getting them over the scales, it's a fairly atraumatic experience for them as well. Like if it's not associated with vaccinations or anything that's horrible, they just come into the yards, they run through the crush, and they go again. And so actually, it can also make that experience a more positive thing for them while they're also collecting valuable information. I agree. I think that you cannot underestimate how valuable that information is, and you can buy a set of scales for under a couple of grand if you match them up with an NLIS wand, so that you've got ability to scan the animal and weigh it. It keeps all the data for you really quite basically, and you can actually just go in and say, we weighed this mob in January, we weighed them again in March. They've grown at 0.45 kilos a day through the toughest part of the year. I'm happy enough with that, and they're still on target to reach their weights. You pat yourself on the back. If you weigh them in January and you weigh them again in March and they've gone backwards, you know that you've got to do something. You can't just sit back passively and expect it to fix itself. You're going to be compromising those young animals in their growth of their frame, and so you really need to put some supplementary feed into those animals to make sure that they hit their targets and grow to the size, so that you're not going to compromise their ability to deliver you a live calf, come 2 years old.
Thanks, Rob. So we have 25 minutes for questions. We'll start with this one. In the calving kit, would you recommend a pain relief anti-inflammatory? If so, which one would you recommend? And the second part is, does it make a difference to mothering up and general recovery?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Calving is a painful procedure. And so I was involved in a trial a few years ago where we thought that we could give cows pain relief when they started labour, and that it would be a really good thing. And it actually didn't turn out to be as good as we thought it might be, because we don't want to give non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or steroids either to animals that are right on the point of calving. But if you wait until after the cow is calved, so the calf is on the ground, if she's had a traumatic calving, if you've assisted her or it's been a difficult calving, I actually think that using an anti-inflammatory is probably not a bad thing. The reason being, I always tell people, if you feel better, you are better. And so if you've got a cow that's a bit stiff and sore and you give her an anti-inflammatory, you might make her feel a little bit better, and so she might mother up a little better, and things work all right. The concerns that I have is that if you're also using body temperature as a measure of whether the cow has developed an infection, if you've given her a long-acting anti-inflammatory like, say, meloxicam, which is probably my preferred anti-inflammatory for a beef animal, if you've given her a meloxicam injection and you're measuring her body temperature, it might not necessarily spike for a couple of days, even if she has an infection, because of that anti-inflammatory effect. So there's the general advice would be, absolutely, if you've had a traumatic calving and it's been difficult and you've intervened and you've pulled a big calf out, definitely give them the anti-inflammatory. If they are knuckly or paralyzed, then absolutely give them an anti-inflammatory. You do need to talk to your veterinarian so that they can prescribe it for you on the farm. If you haven't had a vet on the farm in 12 months, they may require a visit. But I do believe that for cost effectiveness, it's hard to go past meloxicam, because a single dose, 2.5 mils per 100 kilos of body weight under the skin, will provide anti-inflammatory effect for at least a couple of days. And so there are other anti-inflammatories, ketoprofen, you can use tolfidine or tolfaject, both great anti-inflammatories, but more expensive on a per dose basis, and they don't last quite as long. So yeah, for what it's worth, if I was going to put an anti-inflammatory in my calving kit, it would be meloxicam. And I always tell people that anti-inflammatories are better given too early than too late. And the best time to give a cow with paralysis an anti-inflammatory is half an hour before she became paralyzed, and the next best time is right now. So in other words, if you've pulled a calf out, the heifer's gone down in the yard, in the crush, before I even try and get her up, I now give her anti-inflammatory. And then if she gets up and walks away with a bit of a stagger, I know that she's got the anti-inflammatory on board. But if she doesn't get up, she's got it into her completely as early as possible. So that's a great question. Thank you for that question.
And a great answer. If the uterus is twisted, can it be untwisted, or is it a cesarean job?
It depends entirely on how twisted. Normally speaking, and I'm broadly generalizing, if we can get either our hands in to get a feed or a foot out to get hold of, we've got what we call detorsion rods. And so you put like ropes or chains on the feet of the calf, and then you actually literally untwist them up so that you twist the opposite direction that the uterus is twisted. Sometimes we can even lay the cow on her side and sort of roll the calf to untwist the calf. So my short answer is, sometimes we can untwist them. Most of the time, if they've got a 90 degree to 180 degree torsion, where you can get your hands in and get hold of the feet, or you can leave and pull the feet out sometimes to detors them, that's a hell of a lot easier. If they're twisted through 360 degrees, so there's a complete torsion, you can't even get your hand in to grab hold of a foot, they always end up as cesareans or dead animals.
Will weaner calves display compensatory growth if they stall over summer?
Yes. So if they've stalled over summer, you might not have grown their frame, but then if you get a good autumn break, they might still end up at a puberty weight, but they're smaller in frame than they could have or should have been. And that's what our challenge is, because we can often still get them to reach their target weight. So whilst I said earlier that weighing them is a great thing, weighing them, if they're not going forwards, it's more important about knowing that they're not going forwards. And that's why you need to do it regularly, because if you could weigh them as a calf and record their birth weight for an EBV at 38 kilos, and if the next time you weigh them is at the time you're about to mate them, they might be there, but they might have gone like a roller coaster along the way and had periods where they weren't growing and then periods where they were compensating for that. And they may weigh okay, but their frame size will be smaller than what it could have and should have been. Because if we're talking about reducing the risk of dystocias, then the frame, the size of the pelvis is a critical factor, because the bigger the pelvis, the bigger the calf that can fit through it. And that basically is where that equation ends.
Yep. And relating to that growth, if heifers were stunted at the start of their life, does waiting an extra year before joining help them, or will they never catch up?
If they were stunted, waiting longer time will mean that they will reach the critical mating weights. So they'll reach critical mating weights, but they probably never will be the same frame size as they would have been, because the skeletal growth doesn't compensate to the same extent that the body weight will. And so that's not to say that they won't get any bigger, but they will not necessarily reach their full potential. And so they might end up still big enough to be completely viable breeders. But if you have a problem with dystocias, then that is a factor that I always would look at, is that early stage nutrition. If they've got calves on cows and they're struggling a bit, maybe putting a drip feeder out or something so the calves can supplement, just to keep them growing, particularly if they're protein deficient, because the pastures have just completely dried off and died off. There might be enough bulk to keep their ribs apart, but their frame's not growing as well as we'd like it. And so I would definitely say yes, they can catch up in weight, and carrying them over to calve as 3-year-olds instead of 2-year-olds. That's always fraught with danger. In our dairy herds, we now pretty much to recommend against doing that, just simply because you've got such a lot of extra costs involved in carrying those animals empty for a year. Plus, you end up with more troubles as 3-year-olds, because they often end up fat by the time they're a 3-year-old and they've not been under any pressure. And so, yeah, I'm not a massive fan of carrying over animals that didn't make the cut in the first instance, but I recognize that people have to do it. And so if you do have to do it, then your sire selection and looking at calving ease direct becomes super important in those breeding decisions. And so you might have had one thing not go your way, and so you've got to put a little bit more emphasis on your sire selection, and then you've also got to put a little bit more emphasis on knowing their calving due dates and supervising them more closely at calving to get the better outcomes that you're looking for. So there's always a way we can jiggle juggle the balls to try and make sure that we get the best outcome, even if it's not the ideal outcome.
And could you expand on the pros and cons of carving down a rising 3-year-old? You just touched on it there a little bit.
I think we just touched on it there. The cons is that the economics of it are really challenging, because by the time you carry a heifer, like getting a heifer to join the herd and be productive, you've got sunk all those rearing costs into it, all those costs as far as feed and drenches and everything. And if you have her unproductive for 1 year longer, the economics of that are tragic. If the reason why she's carried over is because she also hadn't reached her targets because she's stunted or undergrown or small of stature, then the compromise that you make is that you really are worried that those animals won't be perform as well as they could have, and you might end up with, instead of 10 to 15% typical heifer dystocia rates, you might be 20%. So that affects impacts the economics of it. So yeah, it's it's normally better in almost all circumstances. It's better to know how the animals are growing and supplement them to get to where they should be than it is to just let the problem drift and compound your losses. But easy for me to say, I'm not the one who's got to cash flow that.
Yep. Nutrition advice around cow twinning.
Around cow twinning?
Yeah.
As far as people, if they're feeding, are they going to get more twins? Is that what you mean?
I think if a cow has twins, is there different nutrition advice?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking because there's sometimes we recommend trying to join animals on a rising plane of nutrition so that their feed is improving in the 6 to 8 weeks before you join them. And one of the consequences of that is that you do increase slightly the risk of twins. If you've scanned a cow and she's got twins in her, and you know that she's going to calve with twins, you think about what's happening metabolically to that cow. You've almost got double the amount of fluid, double the amount of calcium going into a skeleton. And so clearly supplementing those animals, if required, maintain their body condition in that as a beef animal, 3 to 3.5, 3.25 out of 5. And, that means that you've got to look at her. You can't see the individual spinous processes along her back. To look at her from behind, her pin bones are filled. They're not bulging and they're not hollow, but the pin bones are filled between the pins and the tail. So if you maintain her in that level of body condition with the nutrition you've got available, you probably don't need to get too excited. But if she's struggling because she's putting a pile of stuff into that, those twin fetuses, you may find that you do need to supplement those cows carrying twins. And it very much is that the cow will tell you by her body condition. And as they get closer to calving, be conscious of the fact, though, that twins take up an enormous amount of room. And so body condition tells us how they're doing sort of historically a month ago, whereas like if they become really, really pregnant and they're not eating enough, just being aware that providing them with really high quality forages in that particularly last 3 weeks is often worthwhile. So you might find even if they're in adequate body condition, supplementing them for those last few weeks with some higher quality forages is not a terrible idea. But it does rely on you knowing that they're having twins. And so usually that would mean that they've been scanned in calf as carrying twins.
If you have a heifer that's needed assistance, would you consider culling that heifer, or would you is that heifer more likely to have issues moving forward?
That's a good question. I should have addressed that. I apologise for not addressing that in my slide. That is a really good question. Selecting for calving issues will impact on the future of the herd. So if a heifer, for example, and it depends a little bit on why she didn't have a calf. If the reason why she couldn't deliver the calf from her was because an oversized, so a big calf relative to her pelvis, so it's what we call fetopelvic disproportion. If the reason for that is because she's not well grown and she never was, then I would cull that heifer. If the reason why she didn't calve is because it's a normal sized calf, but it just was unlucky and the foot was back or the head was twisted to the side, and with a relatively simple correction, that calf comes out, I'm going to be a little bit more forgiving for that cow. Or that heifer. And so it really does come down a little bit to why she didn't deliver the calf. If it's because the calf was oversized, and even if the calf, like I've had calves that have been terribly difficult to pull out of a heifer, and you lay it on the ground and you think, you're not even that big. So that's a heifer that gets culled. But if you lay the calf on the ground after you put it out and the calf was a giant, and you've like, wow, that calf is huge, and then the sire that you used was throwing big calves, then you might be more forgiving for that heifer. So I guess what I would say is that you've got to try and decide whether it was a heifer factor or whether it was dumb luck or whether it was sire. And if it was just dumb luck, or if it was poor sire selection, and you used a bull with bad calving ease over that heifer, but she's adequately grown, and if all the heifers had problems, then you just go, it is what it is. So I guess that there's it's a non-answer to the question in saying that it would depend a little bit. But as a broad general rule, the herds that select aggressively for eliminating calving problems definitely see improvement year on year on year. So, we've got some herds where they do not keep animals that have calving problems, and they have less calving problems than herds that do. So there's something in that.
Great. Thanks for all the questions. There's a few more here. What is the best method to align the head in the birth canal? We have had a few previously that we couldn't get out due to the head flopping to the side and not sitting on top of the legs.
Yeah, I decided not to put those slides in this tonight's presentation, but they're in last night's presentation. I really highly recommend using a head snare. So a soft rope usually, and you put it behind the ears and in the mouth, so that like you've got a loop. The loop goes around behind the ears and the loop's in the mouth, so that as you pull, you're pulling firmly on the head. I don't recommend eye hooks or jaw snares where you put the rope just around the bottom jaw in live calves, because there's a high risk of fracturing the jaw or damaging the eyes or the eye socket using eye hooks. That said, I know people that use them really successfully and they're really good at it. So if you're very skilled at it, knock yourself out. But if you're not, then a head snare is the way to go. The other alternative to a soft rope head snare is that you can buy these cool little they're like a wishbone with a wire or rope that goes out around the wishbone, and you can just pull through them. So you slide that up over the nose and then it loops it over the head, and then you pull it back and it tightens. And then you can sort of wiggle it down, get it into the mouth, and then you pull on that. And it actually works quite well. And I've got a few farmers using those that I think they bought them, off shoe for out of rural stores. You can go and buy them probably at, Ag Warehouse, something like that. You'll find that there are head snares commercially available, but definitely putting a head snare on is the way to go. But be aware, if you put it on the bottom jaw, or if you put eye hooks in the eyes in a live calf, you can damage them.
And that's a good point you make. There was a good diagram in last night's webinar of that head snare.
Look at the slides of that. It's really quite a good picture.
At what point do you supplement feed a calf if they are looking skinny but still getting milk?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. If they're still getting milk, but obviously they're not getting enough because the cows, are struggling, and they're not necessarily, it's often not the cow's fault if it's the nutrition is the issue. You can do one of two things. You can supplement the whole lot of them by feeding the cows and the calves. But the other thing you can do is you can make up what we call creep feeders, which is where in a corner of a paddock you'll have a feeder, often an automatic feeder or troughs or something like that, and you've got bars that allow the calves to enter, but the cows can't. So the cows aren't eating all the calf pellets or the calf grain, but the calves can come in, supplement, and leave. And those are often good. But again, if I've got calves on cows that are not growing well, I want to make sure that they're also not suffering from coccidiosis or other parasites, because if you've got an individual that's affected, it's probably more likely an individual disease problem. But if as a group the calves aren't thriving, it's because the cows are struggling to produce the milk that you want them to produce. You can supplement the calves only by using a creep feed type system, where you can eliminate the cows from being able to eat the grain. You might supplement the cows with some hay, because to maintain their body condition. But if the budget's a little bit tight, you just can use a calf grain mix, a 20% protein or 19% protein calf grain mix. And as I say, they often can be fed either in a feeder or limit, like just in a trough, or limit fed, and they work quite well.
What is your go-to process after a calf is born? I think you mentioned that last night as well.
Yeah, we did mention it last night, but I'll run through it quickly again. Like I like to make sure I check the calf for abnormalities, because if a calf has got a deformity, a fracture or a spina bifida or something awful, a cleft palate, I euthanize them straight away. I don't muck around with them. Don't photograph them, put them on Facebook, don't do all that sort of stuff. Just euthanize them. If a calf's born healthy and alive and it does all the right things, and again in my presentation last night, there was like, I want them to be able to sit up on their sternum. I want them to be able to try and stand. I want them to suckle within 2 hours. All the targets that we set for them are written out. I check their navel. If their navel's torn off really short or they're bleeding from the navel, I will sometimes clamp them or tie them. But generally speaking, I just spray them with iodine. If you are supplementing them with colostrum, then that's the time to do it. Most of the time with our beef animals, we rely on them suckling the colostrum from the cow. But if you've had a difficult calving and the calf's got a big swollen tongue, or whatever, the cow's down or the heifer's down, having supplemental colostrum available, you can get some and freeze it. A lot of people get it from dairy farms and use that colostrum. I always say, great idea, but be aware of the biosecurity risks of doing that, because it's not without risk if you get colostrum from somewhere else. But if you're able to collect colostrum from a cow that's got a lot and she's not a wild beast that wants to kill you, and you can hand milk 2 litres of colostrum out of and put her in the freezer, that's brilliant. And so, with our beef herds, it's a little bit more challenging. Our dairy animals, it's easy. We just collect colostrum from the cow at her first milking. I really do like, as I say, for people to have a little bit on hand to make sure that the calf doesn't suffer or doesn't miss out, I suppose, more to the point. And as far as if the weather conditions are awful, I will dry those calves with a towel. That's why I like to have towels, nice, scungy old but fluffy enough towels in the calving kit, so that you can dry that moisture off them. Because if they're wet and cold and the wind's blowing over them, they will lose their body heat really quickly. They usually don't start shivering for the first hour, and so they can lose a lot of body weight in that first hour. And if they've chilled a lot, then they burn off that brown fat supply, which is quite limited. They burn it off in no time at all, and then they've got no reserve up their sleeve if they run into some trouble. And so trying to maintain body temperature is also an important part in dealing with a calf that you've assisted. I sit them up on their sternum with their elbows out and their back legs up beside their ears. Again, there's a great picture in the slides from last night of how to do that. And I do think that's 1,000 times better to do that than it is to swing them around or hang them over gates or leave them just laying down in the shit, struggling. It's better to take them somewhere clean, sit them up, get their elbows out so they can expand both sides of their chest, and then sit their back legs up beside their elbows, sort of almost like a frog position, so that they're resting on their sternum. And that's probably the best thing you can do for them.
That's great advice. Do you encourage using hormones or oxytocin during calving difficulties at some sort of difficult instances?
Okay, so I never give them oxytocin until after I've got the calf out, because if you give them oxytocin to try and get them to push harder or something like that, you do run the risk of damaging the uterus. And so I would never give oxytocin to a cow that's trying to calve. Personally, there are some drugs that we use, and there's one of them called Planapart, which is a drug that helps to relax the uterus. And I particularly like that drug. It's expensive as poison, but it's a really good drug because it relaxes the uterus. And so if I'm trying to manipulate a malpresented calf, it gives me a little bit of an advantage. And so a lot of the time, the vets, when they come out, they will give a shot of Planapart, and they'll put an epidural in the tail just to help to paralyze that back end so that it's not painful when we're manipulating. And so they tend to strain less against us, but also it helps to relax, all of that perineum, so that when we're, manipulating calves, it's not stimulating them to strain against us. And so that would be the usual drugs that I would use. The only other drugs that I use around calving time, I mentioned it last night, I'll mention it again tonight, is there are occasions where I'll want to induce a close to term heifer or cow. It might be because they've had a run of oversized calves and I want to make sure I'm there to supervise the delivery. It may be because of other reasons, but the animal's down or unwell or whatever. And when I do that, I do it with a mixture of cortisone and prostaglandin. again, you've got to talk to your veterinarians about that, because they probably will have their own protocols, and they would also need to prescribe those drugs for you. But I often, getting back to the oxytocin, if I've done a really difficult pull, I'll often give them a shot of oxytocin afterwards, just to help their uterus to contract. I don't believe that it does a lot to help them clean and get rid of their afterbirth, but I do think that it helps their uterus to contract. And I probably don't have any really good data or evidence to support this, but I have done it ever since I was a graduate. And I reckon that it probably reduces the risk a little bit of them prolapsing post calving if you get their uterus to contract up rather than just laying there all floppy after you've pulled a big calf out of them. So I didn't put any drugs in my calving kit because, again, they require prescribing. But if you've got access to oxytocin, it's not a bad idea to have a bit to give after you've calved them. If you've got access to anti-inflammatories, it's not a bad idea to have some of that in your calving kit to give them if they've had a traumatic or difficult calving. And if it's been contaminated or if the calf's dead, an antibiotic, broad spectrum antibiotic like tetracycline, oxytetracycline, is also indicated in those cases. And so I think that it does require, though, for people to have a good relationship with their veterinarian so that they can potentially have access to those products if needed.
Great. And one more while we're talking about drugs. Talking about meloxicam, do you think buccal-gesic OTM is as good as injectable?
Remembering buccal-gesic, it's got to go in the cheek pouch, and it's absorbed from the cheek pouch. That's why it's called buccal-gesic. It goes in the buccal cavity. So for adult animals, I don't use it as much. There is a new version, though, of meloxicam, which is an oral meloxicam called Meloxicare, which actually is oral. So it's not a buccal, it doesn't have to sit in the cheek pouch. You squirt it down their throat. And so certainly meloxicam oral is an option, in an alternative to injectable. And certainly for, say, somebody who was cattle care accredited and didn't want to be using injections or wanting to minimize the injections of product, you could use something like a Meloxicare oral. But as I say, buccal-gesic is great, but it does require to be sat in that buccal pouch. And so if you squirt it in, they swallow it, it probably doesn't work quite as effectively as and it's not certainly the way it was registered to be used. We use it heaps in calves when we're disbudding them or marking them, because you can just sit it in the calf's cheek and they just sort of on it. And it seems to work quite well in those. But yeah, good product, but maybe a little challenging to use in a beef cow that's just calved, that's probably not all that happy about you trying to place it gently in her buccal pouch.
And we have one more. This will be the last one for tonight. What are your thoughts on drenching for parasites, only the bottom percentage with the lowest growth rate?
Yeah, I'll reserve my judgment on that. I would probably I'd rather people do a worm egg count of those animals and see whether they are wormy. And if they are wormy, you've got to assume that all the mob, we're talking young stock now, all the mob have worms. For adult cows, drenching individual animals that look a bit wormy, I don't have a problem with people doing that, because adult cows usually, and this is broadly generalizing, usually once they're adults, their immune system tends to keep their worm burdens in check. When they're pregnant, though, they do get a resistance or a relaxation of their resistance, because their immunity just drops a little bit, because they've got a parasite inside their belly, and so their immunity will tend to drop a little bit. So some cows might show some signs of worms even as adults. So treating it one cow here and one cow there that looks a bit wormy, I don't lose too much sleep over that. But in a mob of young animals, just saying I'm only going to drench the tail end, I'm not going to worry about the rest of them, I think that would be foolhardy. And I would not recommend it unless you had worm egg count data to support doing that. Because young stock, if they're running in the same paddocks, you assume that the worst affected have probably the worst immune response, but the others will be getting it. And certainly the data that I've been looking at recently would suggest that probably much lower worm egg counts than what we used to think were significant are significant. So whereas we used to sort of say 100 or 150 worm eggs, is anything below that, maybe you don't. Now it's probably we're changing our recommendations and we're lowering that threshold quite substantially, because we want to make sure that we keep the young stock growing as effectively as we can.
Thanks, Rob. And just on that last question, who makes Meloxicare Oral?
I don't know. I think it's Parnell, maybe. I'm not sure.
So check with a vet.
Yeah, check with the vets.
Yeah.
We sell a bit of it, but we do use a lot more Meloxicam injectable. Metacam is the brand name of it, and but we find that the idea of the challenge with the Meloxicare and the Buckalgesic is drawing out single doses, and then what do you do with the rest of it? Whereas with a bottle, if you're careful and use sterile needles, that's my other bugbear. While I've got people on the line, they're a captive audience. Buy new needles and syringes. Don't be miserable. Especially if you're sticking a needle into a bottle of something that you're going to reuse again. Sticking a needle that's been dirty and horrible and then contaminating that bottle is a terrible idea. Syringes are cheap, needles are cheaper. Don't be tight.
Great advice there, Rob. We might leave it there. There's a comment here. Thank you, Rob. Your knowledge is invaluable. And I think we can all agree with that. So thank you very much for joining us and presenting the last couple of nights.
Appreciate it and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Hopefully everyone can at least take a couple of pointers and rules of thumbs back onto their farm, and hopefully you can implement some of these points that were discussed tonight. So if you have pregnant cows, all the best for the upcoming calving season. Thanks for joining us. There will be slides available and a link to this recording for your use. Thanks very much. Good night.
My pleasure, and sorry for the stuff up with the slides at the start. I'd selected the wrong screen.
Also, I apologize for that. Good night, everyone.
Take care. Bye.